All right, anybody out there have an 18-volt Ryobi hand vac that sometimes doesn't suck? I'm just kidding. They are great tools, but this one has lost its vacuum. The button on the top sticks, it's hard to open up, and the battery in the back isn't taking a charge, at least not when I'm plugging it into the wall adapter. And so the wall adapter, from this perspective, at least mine, looked clean enough, but when plugged in, it wasn't working. Finally getting that front open, the button was sticking. And I think from a perspective of why isn't a vacuum sucking, the clean out of the filter is your first step. In this instance, the filter had been not cleaned in quite some time, it appeared. So after knocking out the dust and clearing it out just a little bit, I took a look at the seal in the placement where it sets because that had accumulated dust. This unit is going on 10 years. Now I happen to have some electronic cleaner. You don't have to use this. You could use rubbing alcohol. But I happen to have some electronic cleaner nearby and sprayed that down in there and went ahead and cleaned off as much of the dust that I could and reseated the filter. Now on the outside of the filter, the actual dust housing there, or dust casing or whatever it's called, there is another rubber seal, and that keeps the air from escaping when the vacuum is engaged. And that definitely needs to be kept clean. And you can see here that it wasn't. That is likely the number one culprit for why the vacuum was not sucking. Now, on the inside of the vacuum housing itself, where the dust accumulates, there's a little rubber flap that you can see. So as the airflow comes in, it pushes that rubber flap open. And if anything gets into the space in front of that rubber flap, as far as if any dust gets into the crease, it makes it so that the rubber flap does not close properly, and it can make dust and junk fall back out. Now, on the inside of the housing, you can see another filter. That filter is there to keep dust from entering into the motor itself. Now, because the vehicle or the vacuum cleaner in this case wasn't charging, I went ahead and decided to open up the casing. Now, the one thing I like about Ryobi tools, because they're a simple, relatively inexpensive unit, is that they come apart relatively easily normally. They have Phillips head screwdriver screws, and it's just something that most people can do. The hardest part about taking these apart for me is I have a small work surface right now, and the floor of my barn is plank flooring with wide gaps. So if I drop any of these screws, I'm going to have to figure out a way to replace them. Thankfully, I didn't drop any of them. And when you're pulling this thing apart, you're going to find it might stick. You're going to be like, where's that extra screw that I'm missing? It's not a screw. Right up at the front is this little clasp you got to push down. And as you're pushing it down, go ahead and put some tension on the casing. And that clasp is there to keep the dust housing in place when you're using it. And you're going to just want to push that down and pull the casing apart. Now, the side that the screws came out of will be empty. There's nothing attached to it. There's no wires attached to it. So as long as you can get these two pieces to pop apart without cracking anything, you're golden. No damage. Everything's ready to rock. And those two pieces are easily separated. Now here, looking at the actual machine itself, you can see it's pretty simple. We've got a battery input on the far left, the charging receptacle on the bottom, and then of course the motor fan housing component there right in the middle on the right-hand side. There's a button and stuff at the top. Talk about in a second. With the battery inserted here, the unit does function, but I was having difficulties with the charging system with this particular battery. Now, there are a couple different functions set up, and you can kind of, if you've got one of these, see that I'm missing one down at the bottom, and I'll get to that in a second. But basically where my finger is there used to be a sensor or a switch that made it so that when the front housing was attached properly, then the unit could fire up. But if that front housing wasn't attached, then it wouldn't. I had so much difficulty with it back when I was using it frequently that I disconnected that switch and just soldered those two wires together to make it a closed or open or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, a closed switch always. And so I don't have that safety mechanism in there. Now here you can see that I'm using a screwdriver and kind of just poking around. What I had seen is as I opened up the casing that some of the wires had misaligned in their grooves and had gotten pinched there at the top. And while they were not bare, they didn't appear to be shorting or anything like that. It meant that the wear and tear on that particular wire could cause damage if I continued to use it for another decade, which I do intend to do. I happen to have some of this cleaner on hand, like I mentioned earlier, and it is safe to use on electronics. So I went ahead and sprayed some on the housing of the motor there because there had been some light dust accumulating in the back. And I know that that can cause burnout if it gets too much in there. So while I was spraying around, this stuff dries really fast and it shouldn't do any damage. The other thing is you can run power through it. This is only DC, so I ran power through it. And of course, blowing out all that excess allows it to dry off even quicker. And since the vortex on the front, or the impeller on the front was running, I was spraying some into that as well. And that was primarily just to get the excess dust out of that, maybe increasing the suction capability. Now, I used a different battery here, one that had an indicator on it so that I could see that it was able to take a charge. And here, well, the external wall mount charger was connected to the vacuum. I could see that with this different battery, it was in fact charging to the battery. So the original issue that I had been having where, well, putting it on the wall mount, it wasn't taking a charge, may have been from a misaligned mount. It may have just been from a bad battery. Batteries don't actually go bad very frequently with Ryobi, which I have to hand it to them. The batteries that I've had literally since I bought these tools, and they're still going strong. But I don't use them literally like every single day. I know there are some guys out there that use the red or the yellow brands, and they are using those things up. That's fair. Batteries have a shelf life, but they also realistically have a charge cycle life. And charge cycles for these types of batteries are usually around 1,200 to 1,400 cycles before you start seeing your degradation or your batteries going bad. So how many times you charge it matters. All right, here we are. We're just sticking the casing back together and snapping it in place. And as you can see, it pretty much is good to rock. You could use it like this with no screws, but not recommended. Let's go ahead and put those screws right back in. I'm not going to go through every single screw placement. Needless to say that if you see a hole that looks like it should be a screw hole, it's a screw hole. Ryobi does not, they don't hide anything. And so that's good. Here we are. We're going ahead and putting on the screws there, and we'll do one more at the back. And of course, there's all the rest of them that I did there off camera. I got to hand it to Ryobi. I bought a ton of these tools. I say a ton. I bought a box of these tools as a kit back before we bought this house. And I'm really satisfied with the unit so far. They can take a beating and keep going. And even when you have one that maybe burns out because it got dust or debris or something like that in it, this particular vacuum, as an example, only costs like 40 or 50 bucks. And I think it's only about 40 or 50 bucks now. So here we go. We're just putting the filter right back into the hand vac and making sure that it seats well, which I unfortunately did not focus on the camera very well there, and then snapping it back into its clip. Now, I noticed at this point that button still was sticking and I hadn't fixed anything there. And so I went ahead and unclipped it because the button was giving me some trouble. It wasn't snapping, the spring mechanism wasn't snapping back in place the way that it should easily. And that's primarily, there's nothing really complex about that system. It does, however, have a tight tolerance. And so if any dust or debris gets up into that casing, then of course it's going to stick. So here I am just spraying some lithium grease down in there, rubbing it back and forth a few times to work that down into the groove so that the switch mechanism will work as it was intended to, by wiping off the lithium grease and making sure everything's nice and shiny, and double checking to make sure that the housing fits on, it snaps in place. And there you go. Was it worth fixing? In my opinion, yeah, it was worth fixing. Here we go. We've got some extra suction, a lot more suction than it had before. And I think to a degree, it'll work for another decade. I'm happy with Ryobi. I hope something like this helps you. If you like this kind of video, like and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to call these types of videos the Is It Worth Fixing videos. And although this won't be an ongoing series, I do have a few things that this inspired me to fix that I want to show you guys.